A quick art montage is shown on screen. At Home with the DIA presents Behind the Scene, Rivera Court. Presenter Cindy Patrick, a slideshow, and American Sign Language interpreter are on screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Patrick, a docent at the DIA, and it's my pleasure to join the DeafC.A.N group today and give a presentation talk regarding the Rivera Court Diego Rivera murals.
New slide reads, Detroit Industry, Diego Rivera.
Diego Rivera came to Detroit during the Great Depression, and in the very center of the DIA, he created a tribute to industry and workers. These murals reveal his fascination with industrial processes and also highlight his critique of the idea that technology and the advancement of technology could have positive effects on culture, but also beware of the negative effects.
New slide shows two photographs.
At the top left, you see a photograph of the original DIA, which sat on Jefferson, kind of kitty corner across from what is today the Renaissance Center. And at the bottom right, we see the building that we're in today, which was built in 1927. It was designed by the architect Philip Cret, C-R-E-T.
New slide shows an old photograph of the garden court.
In the very center of the building, Philip Cret designed what was called at the time the garden court. And you can see this was about 1930, this photograph. So the original garden court was meant to be a respite or a place where our museum visitors could go and relax. They could smoke a cigar, have a cigarette. And why did they need a place to relax? Because if you think about it, in the 1930s, when people came to the museum, they came by public transportation. So they probably would have been there all day long and they would have needed a place to rest. You can see there's a fountain in the center with water spouting up out of it. As time went on, we realized that fountains and humidity were not good for our building and for the art.
New slide shows today's Rivera Court.
When the court was redesigned, and here you can see it as it is today, but at that time...
New slide shows a photograph of Rivera, 1886 to 1957.
Our director, William Valentiner, and Edsel Ford, son of Henry Ford, who was the president of the Arts Commission, they decided to commission the artist Diego Rivera, R-I-V-E-R-A, to do two of the walls within the garden court and to create frescoes that highlighted the industries of Detroit, and especially the automotive industry, of course, because that was Edsel Ford's livelihood.
New slide shows a piece from Rivera Court's south wall.
So here we see one of the panels in Rivera Court, and this is a portrait of Edsel Ford on the left in the light gray suit and William Valentiner on the right in the darker gray suit. And in his hand, he's holding a tablet, and on that is written the dedication for when the murals were first opened to the public in 1933.
New slide shows a photograph of the east wall.
So the way the murals are configured on the walls of Rivera Court, we have the east wall and the west wall. The east wall would back up to John R. The west wall backs up to Woodward. And then we have the north wall and south wall. North wall backs up to Kirby. South wall backs up to Farnsworth. So here we see the east wall. And we know that in Christian churches, the east wall is where the altar is usually placed. The sun rises in the east. It's the beginning of the day, the beginning of life. And above, you can see on the two top corners, we have two nudes, and these women represent North and South America and the agriculture that is produced from those two continents. And then below them are two smaller panels, and in those panels we have the fruits and vegetables and agriculture of Michigan. Now let's get to that center panel with the baby in the bulb. So here we have an infant in the bulb of a plant. It was known as the germ cell.
New slide shows a close-up of the panel.
And what Rivera was trying to represent here is that everything on this planet is derived from the earth. All forms of life, any technological advances, it all comes from the earth. And on either side of this baby, there are plowshares, which are the blades that are attached to a plow that is used to manually plow and make furrows in the ground for planting. And those two plowshares are pointing right at this baby. So it represents the idea that the agricultural technology of inventing a plow also can have destructive ramifications and be threatening.
New slide shows a photograph of the west wall.
On the west wall, this would be the one that backs up to Woodward. This would be in a Christian church. This would be the place where you would enter and exit. And this is where you enter and exit Rivera Court. You come up Woodward through the Woodward entrance across the Great Hall, and this is the first wall. So on either side of this wall, you can see there are depictions of pipes that would be represented in the factory atmosphere. And above it, you can see that there are some airplanes, and these are called the Aviation Panels. So we'll talk a little bit more about those.
New slide shows a close-up of the Aviation Panel.
In the Aviation Panel to the left, we have planes that are being built for leisure travel. And on the right, we have planes that were being built for wartime production. And this was called the B-41 bomber. The one on the left was the tri-motor, and that was for leisure travel. So here Rivera is representing the aviation technology, that it's being used for leisure travel, but it's also a threatening presence in that it's used for wartime. Beneath that, we have a panel, and this is created with a technique that's called grisaille, G-R-I-S-A-I-L-L-E. That's a French word, and what it means is this monochromatic technique. You can see it's all in one color as opposed to being in, full color. And it's meant to fool your eye and make it look as if this is sculpted right into the wall. So this bottom panel shows the interdependence of the North and South. And that river that you see in the middle is a combination of the Detroit River and the Amazon.
New slide shows a close-up of another panel.
To the left, we can see some men that are working on a dock. To the right, we see someone who is cutting into the trunk of a tree. And then again in the center, we see this river that runs between.
New slide shows a closer image of the west wall.
So this is a call out of that left side of that panel. And this is actually imagery of the Rouge plant bolt slip. So this is where stevedores will be unloading and offloading cargo onto ships. And these would have been the raw materials that were being used to build cars. And a little bit to the right of that, you can see that there is a horizon line, and you can see there's sort of a landscape in the background. Those are actually buildings of Detroit. We have St. Anne's Church. We have some smokestacks that represent what at the time was Wyandotte Chemical. Now I believe it might be BASF. And then we have, sailboats that are traveling across for leisure
New slide
travel.
shows a close-up of the same panel.
To the right end of that grisaille panel, you can see we have people, and you can tell by their faces that they are most likely South American ancestry. And they are harvesting rubber from a rubber tree. So this rubber, of course, was used to create tires. And you can see it says Fordlandia Rubber Tree Plantation in Brazil. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Henry Ford, as a business owner, liked the idea of controlling the entire cycle of the building of a car from start to finish. That meant he didn't want to buy his raw materials from a supplier. He wanted to own the raw material. So his idea was to buy over 200,000 acres in Brazil and plant his own rubber tree plantation. He sent, crews of people down there to build a town and plant these trees. It ended up being a dismal failure for whatever reason. They weren't able to grow healthy trees. And later on, Henry Ford II actually sold this massive, property back to the country of Brazil.
New slide shows two images of the west wall.
On the left side of that doorway, we see what are steam pipes, and they were used in the manufacture of electricity. And below that, we have your blue-collar worker. You can see he's even wearing blue overalls and a blue-collared shirt. And so on the left, we have the detail of a factory worker. And then on the right, we'll see there's a detail of the owner of the company. Notice that this factory worker has on gloves, and on the glove there is a red star. Rivera had a way of inserting symbols and ironies throughout this mural cycle. He had a point that he wanted to get across. We know that Rivera was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party. And we know that even today, the red star represents or is a symbol for communism. Rivera said that it had nothing to do with communism. He said that there was a company in Detroit called the Red Star Glove Factory, and that he noticed when he was in the plant that workers, who needed hand protection wore these gloves. So he had a really good way of explaining his way around the message that he wanted to get across.
New slide shows Rivera side by side with a factory worker from the west wall.
And here you can see a photograph of Rivera, and you can see that factory worker resembles him. We're not sure that he meant for it to be a self-portrait, but yeah, it looks a lot like him.
New slide continues along the west wall.
On the right side of that entry and exit door, here we have the manager or the company owner. And you can see he's wearing a suit. He's an executive. In front of him are the tools of the engineer's trade. He's got his ruler, his pen. And notice he's got a stopwatch there because he has to make sure that, everyone is working up to their potential. To the left of this slide, you can see there's another part of this steam turbine. And if you look closely, it's in the shape of an ear, the bottom of it being the earlobe. And if you compare it to the ear on our manager, it looks a lot like his ear. Well, when Rivera was spending time at the Rouge Factory complex, he noticed that there was surveillance everywhere and that Henry Ford was known to, continually spy on not only his workers, but his foreman and his management. And it was something that, it bothered Rivera. So, he did this call out of this ear to kind of secretly show that surveillance was going on. And the portrait that we have of the manager is actually based upon a combination of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford.
New slide shows a photo of Edison
and Ford. They
were
business partners. Henry Ford's career started his career working for Thomas Edison, and then graduated to owning his own company. But they remained very close friends and business partners. They owned a movie production company together, and they vacationed together with their families frequently.
New slide transitions to a photo of the north wall.
So now we're going to move to the north wall. And the north wall backs up to Kirby Street. The north wall and the south wall are a more complicated vision of industry. And they represent the Rouge Factory complex. So Rivera's challenge was to compress the Rouge Factory complex, which was 1 mile square. It was a city within a city. It had its own fire department and its own police department. And he had to find a way to compress the idea of that huge factory complex onto these 2 walls. And I hope that you'll see by the time we're done with this talk that he was successful. He did a very good job of showing what went on in that factory complex. So in the north wall, he follows an organizational technique that was used also in Christian churches. And we hearken back to that, and he hearkens back to that, because Rivera spent a lot of time in Italy training to learn how to create the fresco technique. And so many of the frescoes that he saw were in Christian churches. And this was the organizational plan that they utilized. So at the top, they would have the monumental ideas. And then as you move down the wall and you got all the way to the bottom, it would end up with kind of like the day-to-day life or the day-to-day ideas of living. And in Christian churches, there was, so much iconography, and it was necessary to illustrate concepts. Because if you think about it, at the time that many of these frescoes were created way back during Renaissance times, people were illiterate. So they needed illustrations, and they needed to be taught these concepts with pictures.
New slide shows a close-up of the north wall.
So if we start at the top, with the monumental ideas, we see that he is representing the races of man. So to the left, we have the races of North and South America, the red race. And beneath them, in the Earth's strata, we see iron ore. To the right, we see Africa, the black race, and beneath it, we see the Earth's strata, coal. So these two raw materials are what were used to make the steel that went into the production of cars. In between those two races of man, we see a volcano. And we'll get to the importance of that volcano in the next slide.
New slide shows a close-up of men working.
So beneath that, we have the large central wall, and this is the Rouge Foundry. And if you look at the top center, you can see that there's combustion and fire, and the heat within this foundry was incredible. And this is right beneath that volcano. The representation of the melting of the iron ore in the foundry is right beneath the volcano. So it's almost as if it's the lava in the bowels of the volcano. On either side of this image, we have what are called spindles. And these tall machines were used to bore and ream metal to create the engine blocks. And if you can see the men in the front, they're moving those engine blocks up and down the line, and you can see where the holes have been bored into them. So the spindles do look somewhat like what's represented here, but Rivera took his artist's license and he also fashioned them after Toltec, Toltec warriors from the Mesoamerican traditional sculptures. So frequently throughout the mural cycle, we'll see where he has, used things from his memory and the history of his culture and reinterpreted those sculptures as machinery.
New slide shows two photographs of the north wall.
On this north wall, in the upper right corner, there is a panel that created a lot of controversy. It created so much controversy that the public called for the destruction of the murals. They wanted them removed. Why? Well, when we look at this panel, if you're from a Christian background, most people would say it looks something like a nativity. We see a baby. We see what could be Mary and Joseph on either side of the baby. We see three men in the background who might be the three wise men or the magi. And we see the farm animals that might have been in the manger. When asked if it represented a nativity, Rivera said, "Oh no, this is the immunization. This is the vaccination panel. That's a doctor and a nurse, and they are immunizing that child for smallpox. And the animals in the front are the animals that they would have tested the vaccine on. And the three men in the background are all three scientists who were living at the time, who had all won Nobel Prizes for advancement in immunology and epidemiology, sorry. But in reality, did he mean for it to be a nativity? Sure he did. Did he mean for it to be controversial? Sure he did. And we're going to see why.
New slide shows the embryo panel on the north wall.
Directly beneath that panel is a smaller panel where we have the healthy human embryo. So again, we're getting back to that idea of the beginning of life and all life coming from Mother Earth.
New slide introduces three photographs.
The controversy. In the immunization panel, the man or the doctor who's on the right was a portrait based on the director at the time, the DIA's director, William Valentiner. The nurse who's on the left is based on the classic movie screen siren, Jean Harlow. And the baby in the center is based on the Lindbergh baby. At the time that Rivera was creating these frescoes, the Lindbergh baby, Lindbergh was an aviator, and his son had been kidnapped and was later murdered. So this was all over the newspapers, and anybody anywhere who received a newspaper and could read knew about this kidnapping. It was, it was a tragic happening. So the thing that really was bothersome to people was that he had taken this nativity scene and turned it into something else. And the idea that Jean Harlow's face should be the face of the nurse, or as a Christian might see Mary, just it made people so upset that they wanted these murals destroyed. Luckily for the Detroit Institute of Arts, which considers the Rivera Court murals to be the most important work of art in the museum, and also for all of us today that we can still enjoy them, there was a man by the name of George Perot who filmed a travelogue in the Detroit Film Theater, which is part of the DIA's building complex. And he was the one who stepped up and said, I'm going to start a petition to save these murals. And in the end of it all, thank goodness they were saved. And Edsel Ford was known to have said, I like them. I want them to stay. So he was a supporter of the murals as well.
New slide moves along the north wall.
In the very upper left corner of that north wall, we see this kind of greenish area. And if you happen to go to the museum, I encourage you to look for it. It looks really different from the rest of that wall. It's pretty easy to pick out. And in this image, the workers are mixing sand to put into molds. And in the center of the upper left, you can see a fellow in a derby. Take note of him.
New slide shows Rivera and his self-portrait.
That is Rivera's self-portrait, and he included it in the murals for posterity. He also signed each wall when he completed it with his name and the date. The murals were created in 1932 and 33, and he worked for 11 months creating them. Can you imagine? He painted 27 different panels in 11 months.
New slide highlights the predella.
So now we're still looking at that north wall, and at the bottom is an area that we call the predella, P-R-E-D-E-L-L-A. That's an Italian word. And this idea of a predella also comes from a Christian church. And along the bottom of the walls in a Christian church, these might be a day in the life of a believer. It might show saints and their attributes or whatever miracle they might be known for. So they were definitely like a teaching tool and descriptive.
New slide continues along the predella.
So Rivera used this idea of a predella to show a day in the life of an automotive worker. And here we see some of the fellows that were working in that foundry, and they're just having lunch. Did they have a lunchroom? Did they have a cafeteria? No, they just sat right down in the factory, right next to the machine where they worked, and ate their lunch.
New slide transitions to the south wall.
Now we're moving to the south wall. This would be the wall that backs up to Farnsworth. And again, we're going to go to the top and we're going to look at the monumental idea of the races of man. So we have from Europe, the white race, and above that is that sits above the raw material of limestone. And on the right, we have from Asia, the yellow race. And below that, we have quartz, crystals, and sand. These are the raw materials that were used to make glass. So cars are made from glass and steel. We have all four of those raw materials all around us.
New slide shows assembly workers.
In the center of the south wall, we have the final assembly. And this would be the actual manufacturing plant floor where they're putting all the pieces of the car together. So here we see the chassis. And then up above, you can see there are some steering wheels and steering columns that are going to be attached to the chassis. And if you'll notice up in the upper left corner, there is quite a compressed crowd of people, and they are there on a plant tour.
New slide zooms in on the plant tour.
The man on the left in the light blue suit who has his back to us is the tour guide. And you can see he's kind of has his hand pointing over to where the people are working. And in this sort of, I guess I'll call it a peanut gallery, we have people who have the leisure time to be able to come on a plant tour. They don't work during the day like the workers in the factory. Some of the people that are shown in this image, if you can see all the way to the left, there's a little call out. He based one of those faces on the cartoon character Dick Tracy. The two boys that are right in the center that have on beanies were based on the Katzenjammer Kids. And did Rivera have a sense of humor? Yes, he did. Did he like the comics and the cartoons? Yes, he did. So he decided to include them on this detail of the south wall.
New slide shows a stamping press on the south wall.
To the right of that manufacturing plant floor, there is an image of a stamping press. This would have been used to stamp the body parts. Sheets of metal would have gone in. This press would come down with an amazing amount of force and would actually, you can see the men in the bottom are holding, looks like they might be fenders. And notice the man with the red hair on the right, how his hair is standing on end. That's to illustrate the force with which this stamping press would come down. It would cause air to come whooshing out and would actually throw, your hair up in the air. It was a very dangerous part of the factory to work in. There weren't a lot of safety measures in place like there are today. And then again, we talked about how Rivera would use a traditional Mexican sculpture to translate some of this machinery. So here we have a photograph of Coatlicue, Coatlicue, and she was the goddess of life and death. And she's her shape and her body has been translated to look like the shape of this stamping press.
New slide zooms out to show the south wall.
So now here we have the entire south wall. You can see Coatlicue on the right. You can see the predella on the bottom. And then in the center, you can see the men in the final assembly.
New slide highlights more details on the south wall.
Up in the very upper left corner, there is a panel which is called the Pharmaceutical Panel. So this entire mural cycle was supposed to illustrate all of the industries of Detroit: the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the automotive industry. Obviously, the two largest walls are devoted to the automotive industry because Edsel Ford, was the one who commissioned these. But, the other industries were considered as well. So the genius of Rivera was that this pharmaceutical panel is placed in such a spot that if you were standing in the center of Rivera Court and you drew a line from your body up through this panel all the way out to the Detroit riverfront, that is exactly where the Parke Davis pharmaceutical plant sat then and still sits today. It's been transformed, I think, into lofts now, but at the time it was, that Rivera created these murals, it was an actual business concern. So he did a lot of things like this, where he connected these murals within the DIA with the world that surrounded the DIA. It really is incredible how his mind worked and how not only did he include symbolism and get across all of the ideas that he wanted to show us, but also connected to the environment around the building. So the man who's in the center, you can see he's a bald head. This was based on the actual
New slide shows a photo of Fritsch,
CEO of Parke Davis, Homer Fritsch. And you can see that there are women working at Parke Davis, and women weren't often seen in factory complexes because the work was too difficult and too physical for them. But it was felt that within this environment, they could do the work. And in the automotive plants, they actually worked in upholstery and they worked in the spark plug part of the factory. So those were jobs that they could do that didn't require a lot of physical labor.
New slide returns to the entire south wall, then an engineering scene.
And as we continue talking about the south wall, now we're going to talk a little bit about that predella. We're continuing with the day in the life of the automotive worker. And here we have the engineers. They're in trade school learning their engineering, and Henry Ford's teaching the class. You can see he's holding his hand up in this gesture of a professorial stance. In other words, I'm going to say something important, listen to me. And they're all, very rapt attention, hands on their cheeks, under their chin, they're listening. And then in front of him, he's got an engine. And this engine sort of has, kind of animal characteristics to it. If you look at the feet, it looks like the feet that could be from an animal. The gear shift is coming out almost like a tail. Well, guess what?
New slide shows two art pieces.
When Rivera was spending his 11 months at the Detroit Institute of Arts, he was visiting all the galleries in the museum, and he was looking at all of the art that hung on the walls and all the sculptures that were in the cases. And so he would have seen this figure that you see at the bottom. It's called a Colima dog, Colima. And it's a fat, sort of a little Chihuahua dog that they were known to be popular in Mexico, probably still are today. And he would have seen this dog in the gallery. So he reinterpreted this dog as this engine. You can see that the feet on the engine are going forward and going in reverse. You can see that the tail has been reinterpreted as the gear shift. And then the front of the engine, where the fan belt is, has two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and looks like the face of the dog. He also reinterpreted Rodin's Thinker, RODIN, which sits out in front of the DIA today, and has the engineering students in the stance of the thinker. So he's giving these common, everyday working men respect, showing that they are important. They're an important cog in this manufacturing process.
New slide shows the pedestrian walkway on the south wall.
And now, as we come to the end of our talk today, at the very last section of the predella in a day in the life of an automotive worker, we see the people leaving at the end of the day. They've punched out on the time clock, and they are walking over this pedestrian bridge to leave the factory complex and go home. And all the cars that you see up to the upper right, those are not the cars that belong to the people that work in the factory. Those are the cars that are going to be sold. These people would have come in either by public transportation or might have even walked to work, but they didn't all own cars. So why does he show them on this pedestrian bridge? Well, he could have shown them walking out of the building, walking across the parking lot, but he used this pedestrian bridge because it was a walkway that went over Miller Road. And if you know anything about Detroit history, you may know about the hunger marches that occurred during the Depression when so many people were laid off. And during one of these hunger marches at the Rouge Factory complex, there was an altercation on this Miller Road overpass, and Ford security actually got into a skirmish, and guns were drawn, and 4 or 5 people were shot and killed. So it was a public relations disaster for Ford Motor Company. Of course, a tragedy for all the families that weren't involved. And so, Rivera wanted to make sure that he included not only, as we said before, not only the productive part of what technology can offer, but also the destructive factors that come along with it.
New slide shows DIA logo.
And with that, I would like to thank all of you for your attention today. It was my pleasure to spend some time with you and to be invited by DeafC.A.N to do this talk for all of you. I hope that you'll maybe take some time and come to the DIA. I want you to know that the safety protocols they have in place are excellent. I've been there several times during our COVID pandemic and felt very comfortable. The museum is open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You do have to go on the DIA's website and reserve a timed entry, but it's as easy as that. You just go in, click on the time that you want to come, and when you arrive at the Farnsworth entrance, then they'll process you in. So thank you very much for listening, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Detroit Institute of Arts logo rolls across the screen. Video fades to black.